Alrighty, great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is GM Soapbox. And today we're going to be talking about faith. Now, I know it's a difficult subject sometimes to talk about, and it feels a little touchy perhaps to delve into it, particularly with the sensitivities that are raised in our world today. But I'm trying to approach it from a slightly different angle. If you're a game master like me and you really want to have faith communities inside of your game, I'm going to show you some ways to handle that, and we'll get right after it. Before you do that, go down and touch up the buttons down below. Touch up. Click the buttons down below and let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience, and let's get started.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
So, let's look at the history before we go any deeper into this, but let's talk about the religious history of role-play games going back to its founding in the 70s. I don't believe there was any particular intent from the designers to particularly focus on religious aspects, but they were pretty much looking at a time in history that was functionally slathered with it. Between the concepts of the Crusades and the advent of investigators and people becoming very advanced in their concepts of what they really were and who they really were, religious history was, as I said, slathered over it. From the earliest games I can recall, we had already the concept of a paladin, the idea of a holy warrior, the idea of religious speakers, and those who were mendicant priests traveling across the world, converting people to their faith community. And this is, and was, even back then, kind of a sticky wicket, because even when the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons book came out, there were discussions of monks, but they did not clarify fundamentally were they Eastern or Western in their origin, and it was very confusing, particularly to a youngster like myself. I was 11, 12, 13 years old when the first of the advanced D&D books came out, and when it spoke of the Grand Master of Flowers, I had no framework. I was raised in the Midwest, I lived in Kansas and Colorado, and there was almost no interaction, at least in my personal experience, with people of Eastern faiths. So the very concept of a monk was only colored by the descriptions provided in ancient lore, and that ancient lore for me would have been the Arthurian legends. The idea of Friar Tuck was a monk by that definition, and therefore the whole concept of religiosity was sort of lost on the player base. And that may not be, of course, the truth for everyone, and there certainly were people older than I was that were playing at the time, but I believe I'm one of the longest duration game masters, and from my experience with the game, religion really wasn't part of the practice of characters, even those who were in the namesake of the Greek gods or the Roman gods or the Norse gods. And the impact of the player's religion was really more focused on their direct relationship with their particular godhead, their particular leadership god. And therefore, the players only played with the element, and I mean that quite literally, just danced along the edges of their religious order. Certainly there were additional amplifying works that a player could look into that would give additional detail. Pardon me. Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, for example, was a material item. Gods, Demigods, and Heroes was a very early portion of the game mechanism that did include information on holy days and all of that. But as a friend of mine was constantly saying, it's a case of mystical hand wavium. You simply waved your hand over it and went on. And it's no wonder later the Dungeons and Dragons rule system eventually obviates the very concept altogether and takes the gods right out of the equation, so that even the player characters who are attempting to role play in that environment are not mandated or conscripted to acting a certain way, which I think is really funny. If you look at the history of role-play games in that early period, there was always the theory, at least proposed, that the game masters somehow had a mystical hold over their players and guided their spiritual advancement. It's like, no, we were just playing a game. And this concept of mandating or exposing the player to a force that they would have to answer to was, in most cases, simply avoided. Having said all that, I'm now going to switch complete gears and talk about the world of Nikos and how I personally have resolved it, because one of the things that I did have in my life that was instrumental in my own development, and that was a religious life. And so the concept that characters might experience something akin to that, at least the connectivity to their community, their communion, if you will, becomes very important. And we've done that in a very unique way within the world of Nikos. And as we go into this, the first thing that I want to specify is that we are not talking about religion by religion's definition. We are not dealing with the cosmology. We're not dealing with the origin of species. We are merely talking about how the characters can interact with each other and with a social network larger than themselves that has a para-religious formation. In particular, I'm speaking, of course, of the concept of philosophies. So as I go through these 10 philosophies, you're going to see how they interact within the world of Nikos and how each one of them has slightly different nuanced experience, and therefore their interactions will be loosely or tightly tied to what would now be considered religious practices. So the first we're going to speak of is the red veils. Now, the order of Ribera, and this image is of Ribera, represents the concept or the philosophy of control and discipline. The concept of the red veils is that we live by a structure and we die by that structure. And if we are being true and faithful to our belief system, we will maintain our own discipline and control of our environments to the greatest effect possible. Now, because of this, the Riberics get quite a bit of a tough time, if you will, from the world, because they enforce their actions, whether we're talking about the concept of control magics like hold person, or whether we're talking about compulsions or even overt dominance. At some point, the concept of the order of the red veil carries with it that kind of depth and intensity. Followers, therefore, have direct commands in terms of what their daily ablutions, their daily rituals will be, and if they falter in any of these, they find themselves under their own leverage, so to speak, hoisted upon their own petard, as it were. Because of that, therefore, players who advocate for the red veils are those that get up and make their bed in the morning and make sure that they keep everything in order, and they're never late. They're never diverted. They're constantly focusing on what they have to do and what they must do to maintain their discipline. Akin to the red veil are the blue veils, and this is the orders of Carolus, and the Carolinian order fundamentally are great protectors. They are the shield and the armor that would be wrapped around the world, and they advocate for some of the avocations of the red veil in terms of order and discipline, but they are much more focused on preventing things that might be dangerous. So they tend to do security rituals. They usually have double and triple the number of servants that they send on a certain job to make sure that all of the I's are crossed and the T's are dotted and everything is in good order, because the safety and the security of the members of the Blue Veils is paramount to any other form. Yes, they will take up arms against an enemy who would threaten them, but they focus predominantly on how best that they can protect their flock. In the case of the Green Veil, the Viridian Order, these individuals dedicate themselves to preserving and maintaining life at virtually any cost. They are perhaps more chaotic than you might think a religious order might be, but they do focus on natural rhythms and patternistic approaches to things, even going to the point of risking their own lives to give opportunity for others to live. And they do tend to take losses very seriously, and have even gone to the point of bordering on chaotic in reaching past the boundaries sometimes to try to dredge someone back from the dark side of the cycle of life. They recognize the cycle, but they don't necessarily prefer to let it control them, but instead to work to give life. Now, this means, therefore, that their rituals are quite often more outward-facing than perhaps inward, and are fairly self-effacing. As they reach out to do these good things, they don't necessarily heap upon themselves glory or honor, but instead focus on celebrating the very lives that they've saved. If there are people who have a joy about their existence within the world of Nikos, these would be the beings who advocate for the Orange Veils. The Arentian Order fundamentally accept their position wherever they are in life, and accept the ups and the downs, the positives and negatives. Their range of magical effects are going to be more along the lines of entertaining and presenting a positive opinion about the world. They do not suffer when wronged. In fact, they anticipate that the wrong was being done for a purpose, and therefore advocate even for the persons who would have put them down. Magics, therefore, are going to be celebratory in nature. Some would say perhaps frivolous, because the Orange Veil is simply about enjoying and appreciating everything that we have as we have it. Next, we come to the Generines, and the Order of Genera are obviously very independently minded. Their concept is focused upon the philosophy of liberty and freedoms, and therefore find themselves quite often facing off against, for example, the Red Veil. They acknowledge each other's existence, but they treat each other with the the stiff arm strategy, simply keep the others at bay and keep them from interfering. A red veil and a black veil walking into a bar begins quite a few jokes in the world of Nikos, because the Generines are very much about what is free and what is simple and what is independent about individuals. And this means that quite often members of the Generine cult are off-putting or distant. And this has more to do with their understanding of how the soul has to interact with the world around it. Having said that, the concept of the Generine, their magics tend to work on aspects of liberty. So freeing others from imprisonment, chain breakers, oath breakers, the idea that you have a obligation placed upon you to be as free as possible lends itself towards libertinism, and therefore they are in many cases considered to be wild cards, because they simply are going to do what's best for any individual, themselves included. The next are the Yellow Veils, and the Flavians tend to find themselves constantly changing. As a matter of fact, one of their edicts is never the same thing twice, and so therefore the very concept of their faith is evidenced simply by how much they change over their lives, whether that means that they gain excessive weight from time to time, or decide to take up yoga, or whatever cultural limitations they want to put on themselves. They do so at a whim, and are therefore not bound to the traditional rituals. If a person is playing a character but wants to play a priest, but doesn't want to have any of the limitations of such, the Flavian order is probably their best bet in terms of their understanding of the world. Their magics are span the range from sharp and disciplinary all the way up to crazy and impetuous and bizarre. But the idea of their nonetheless having a faith amongst themselves is a surprising anchor that the Yellow Veil has, perhaps more so than some of the others. Now imagine having a culture that advocates for complete purity. And when I refer to purity in this case, I mean the purity that is nothingness. The nihilist order, name matches exactly what they are. They look for magics that will end things. So they tend to, while they will perform healing magics, they tend to advocate for a faithless healing process, and therefore a nihilist priest quite often will take medicinal healing mechanisms so that they don't have to advocate for the magic use thereof, because their perception is that magic should be at peace. Magic should no longer be advocated for in any kind of physical action. So they are pretty good at, ironically, counter effects and negations. And while it doesn't seem logical for there to be an entire school of thought that would take this position, nonetheless, they are quite a humorous group. If you get down to the humor of it, they will, for example, if you ask them if they think that silence is golden, they would say that nothing pleases them more. Double entendre, because nothing is the absence of sound as well. So the idea of the nihilist is simply somebody who simply wants to put a kibosh on it, and whatever anybody else is doing, including what they think is fun, can itself be quite humorous when pursued from the standpoint of a nihilist priest. Of course, there's those who advocate for messing with time, and in a world like Nikos that has 9 specific iterations that have fallen in the past and that the players can actually interact with and engage in time travel within. The Purpurine Order is perfect because they advocate for all forms of all life everywhere, and so they advocate for the creation of multiverses and the splintering of uniform cultures and the multitude and multiplex, if you will, of the universe. And therefore their magics have to do with, of course, temporal things like moving through time, making time move faster or slower and such. And it's really more of an exercise, a mental exercise, if you will, to talk about what the outcome of such would be. You could get into a grandfather paradox conversation with a purpurine and spend that time day after day, or perhaps never talk of it again. So the concept, therefore, of time as a philosophical discussion point advocates for there to be magics that are focused on that, and therefore religions devoted to that. Now, only a slight shade different, the Varisians are those who advocate for the singularity of truth. Now, the Indocines, or the Varisians, find themselves quite often at odds with other communities. For example, they can't abide very well with the concept of the Arentians, who believe that life can take a lot of different facets and just have to deal with all of them. Indocines instead say, no, there's only one truth and we must seek it out. The Indocines tend to favor a monotheistic religion, in fact, whereas most of the others will only look at the concept of their nature as being part of a multiplex. So the Varisians, therefore, are in some ways the most dogmatic of the individual groups because they see there is only one truth to be had. Ironically, protecting this one secret means that they are arguably the most secretive of the organizations that have developed in the world over the last iterations or so. And then we come to the big one, so to speak, the followers of Val, and her name is Val, and therefore they are the Vaults. They advocate for power's sake, and because of that, tend to be the least scrupulous. They tend to be the most problematic of the faith communities, only because they see a multiplicity of solutions at the same time. Similar to the Purpurines, they do like to dabble in the end result because they see the ends always justifies the means, and therefore the means can always be malleable. Of course, this leads to great conversational debate between the members of the various veils, and hence they are one of the most what's the word I'm looking for? Contentious of faith communities in the world of Nikos, and yet they are fundamentally the most widespread collective religion on the planet. So I've given a broad brush explanation of how the different faith communities, the philosophical standpoints of the world of Nikos apply. So I would like to ask how you play at Faith. What do you use in your game sessions to provide your players with the regimentation that they hope for when they take on, when they take on religious positionings? And how do we carry that forward for others? I'd love to hear your comments. Write them down below and let's have a great conversation. Do remember we record 5 days a week, and I will see you in the next episode. Remember, my grandfather always said, "That's enough work, now go play."